Thank you so much for that warm welcome. It has been a long day, a fun day. I don't know how many folks here are severely jet-lagged. I'm from the States, and I, too, am somehow existing 6 hours in the future. I'm not really sure how that works, but if you're tired, try to wake up a little bit. This is the last talk of the day, and then we can go party. Okay, so today my talk is on the power of prediction. Mechanisms of childistry and learning, and I am Elizabeth Bonawitz. I'm an Assacute professor of learning sciences. This is my road hop for today. I'm going to be talking about evidence and prediction, and also Lupa and Chris, apparently, whatever that is. Okay, so these two slides I have generated with OpenAI's DALL-E 2. I did them a while ago, and obviously, like Luca earlier today, I'm poking fun at these generative AI tools. You might be wondering why I haven't updated the slides with this year's newest image gen models, which maybe might do a better job. Honestly, I just felt bad for taxing the environment for a visual gag that was only going to get mediocre laughs. But further, I think whether or not these predictive models look like they're getting things right is actually besides the point. The point is that while it's fun to be wowed and impressed with how good generative predictive models like this can be, these models are not helping us learn about human cognition. They're solving the learning problem in a very different way. For example, large language models like ChatGPT are trained on 4 to 5 orders of magnitude more language than children receive by their 5th birthday. And while these models appear really proficient they can do things like they can pass the bar, medical, other kinds of graduate exams, they still fail at basic reasoning tasks that even preschoolers can pass. So the average 4-year-old can demonstrate all kinds of common sense reasoning that LLMs and other generative AIs fail, at least when such tasks are not already explicitly in their training sets. I'm pretty sure my kiddos, for example, could draw a Santa with 5 arms. So as a recent Yo, Kosov, and Gopnik paper suggests, machines may need more than large-scale language and image data to allow the kinds of innovation that small children can produce. It suggests that these prediction engine models are solving the learning problem in a very different way from humans, even if we look at the specific ways these models work via prediction generation and learn through updates to model weights from supervised and unsupervised processes. When we compare it to the way in which human learners make and leverage predictions, I think we're going to find some substantial differences. So this is not actually a talk about GPT or AI. This is a talk about the primary question that's driven my research program for the last 2 decades, and that's just simply what makes children so smart. I want to understand the remarkability of human learning. What is it that makes children so smart? And the partial answer to what makes children so good at learning, and different from these currently hot prediction generation machines, involves 3 key ideas that I've delved into in my work. So first, we're not simply bottom-up, pattern-matching, data-driven learners. Instead, we also build mental models of the world. We can imagine, we're forming abstract causal beliefs, and this top-down knowledge guides our interpretation of data, and it leads to a real richness of understanding. Second, we learn from others. We're tuned into teaching of other people, and we learn more efficiently when information is presented pedagogically. And third, we're curious explorers, both in the world and in our own minds. As active learners, we recognize when we don't know something. We're motivated by our uncertainty and the potential information gain to learn more by exploring the environment and by carrying out mental search and mental simulation. So my research program has been to better understand this building of abstract beliefs, inferences when learning from others, active learning that supports human intelligence. And to investigate these ideas, I combine methodological approaches. So I conduct observational studies, which provide us with a tool to characterize and describe what kinds of factors are present in the learning environments of young children. I conduct EEG studies, which provides us with the tool to characterize and describe the neural underpinnings that might exist for supporting learning. I carry out carefully controlled behavioral experiments so that we can isolate the factors that we think are relevant to guide children's learning and understand their causal role. And finally, I develop computational models so that we can test precisely those causal factors that we uncover from our experiments, explain why those factors are relevant, and also just to help us refine our scientific theories. So that's a lot of methods motivated by a very big question. Today I'm going to frame just a small subset of some of my research around a particular question that's coming back to those original slides, and that's the role of prediction. Namely, why does prompted predictions support learning in early childhood? Or another way to think of this question is, what are the extras that are brought to children's predictions? And spoiler alert, I'm going to suggest that learning via predictions is supported first by children's rich abstract beliefs and the role of this top-down knowledge, and second by the rich inferences that children form from social and pedagogical contexts that shape their interpretation of events. And third, I'll suggest that we learn from predictions because they influence how we explore the world, including via our own mental search and simulation that is triggered when predictions are prompted. So to return to my road hop, today I'm going to talk through some studies that suggest that prediction leverages abstract beliefs, and that we can see this in the kind of surprise responses that are elicited. That prediction is interwoven with pedagogical expectations, and this shapes learning and exploration. And finally, that prediction engages forms of active learning that entail exploration, expectation of information, mental simulation, and recognition of contradicting beliefs. So let's begin with the interplay between prediction and abstract beliefs. And for this, I'm going to turn to a host of research coming out of Garvin Broad's lab. So this is work with Garvin Broad, Maria Theobald, who collected all the data in Germany, and my postdoc, Joseph Colantonio, and also a collaborating research scientist in my lab, Igor Baskanjev. So let me start by saying that Garvin and his team have been studying the role of prediction, among other things, in early elementary school children's reasoning in different science domains, such as water displacement, balance. So for example, in the water displacement domain, early elementary school children who are still developing beliefs about how different objects will displace water, they're given a training task. And all children first complete this pretest phase that allows us to measure their beliefs about whether, for example, it's the size, which is correct, or the material or the weight of an object that matters for how much water it will displace when it's submersed in a tub. And we see many children at this age endorsing the incorrect belief that it's the material or the mass of the object that determines displacement. So in Garvin's tasks, children are then given many trials where they receive feedback about pairs of items that differ in size and material properties. And finally, children complete a post-test where learning is compared to the pre-test is measured. So critically, Garvin's team has contrasted a prediction condition in which children must predict what will happen prior to seeing each outcome during the training trials. And they've contrasted that to a post-diction condition in which children see the outcome of the result first, and then they're asked to report what they had thought would have happened prior to seeing the outcome. So in these studies and in others, Garvin's team, and sometimes in collaboration with my team, led by my postdoc, Joseph Colantonio, we found that children in the prediction conditions are performing better on post-tests and are also showing more flexibility in belief revision during trial-by-trial learning. So the question is, so these predictive prompts, of course, seem to be supporting learning in several kinds of tasks that we're seeing here. And the question is, how might prediction be supporting learning? And one answer is that prediction might support error detection. So if you're making a prediction and you're explicitly committing to an outcome, it becomes clear when that prediction is misaligned with the evidence, which could lead to stronger shifts in belief weights. But even if salience to errors is the main story here, there's reasons to believe that something a little bit more top-down is involved. So for example, first we found that learners had trial-by-trial learning that's correlating more strongly with optimal Bayesian models that are taking children's prior beliefs into account. That is, their abstract causal models of different beliefs about water displacement match well to different children's prior beliefs on their pretest scores. And these are predicting how children's beliefs are evolving over the course of the training. But this is especially so in the conditions in which children are asked to make predictions, suggesting that the predictions are helping guide the process of rationally updating beliefs as new evidence is encountered. But a second reason to believe that top-down knowledge is being brought to bear here is that the kind of surprise that prediction relates to suggests that learners are already bringing sort of their abstract beliefs, these top-down mechanisms, to the learning table. So specifically, we looked at the idea that prediction relates to a surprise response that captures belief change. So let me break this down and talk through a couple of models of the way prediction might support learning via surprise. So first, prediction could help make a conflict between the learner's beliefs and the outcome more salient, as I already suggested. And this might lead to greater surprise response to the sort of unlikeliness of the outcome. And this could be arousing, and that could provide a mental boost for increased attention and memory of the unlikely outcome. But alternatively, prediction might first support belief change by bringing competing models to mind. This could then lead to surprise as a response to the degree of accommodation required to revise those beliefs. So surprise might correlate with learning, but not be a cause of it. Of course, this surprise response might then also increase attention and memory through its arousal properties as a second boost. Or it could be both mechanisms are operating simultaneously. So I'm going to disappoint a little bit at this point in the talk because I don't think I have a definitive answer for you, but I'm going to talk you through how we might attempt to measure these links in hopes of at least understanding more precisely what aspects of this learning story are best captured by our results. So to look at this surprise, we're inspired by a large body of literature that suggests that pupil dilation accompanies the phenomenological affective states, such as surprise, such as we saw in Christoph's talk a little bit earlier today. So following a violation of one's expectation, the pupillary surprise response might be related to learners' ability to successfully revise their beliefs. However, how these physiological states relate to learning remains less well understood. So we considered two different accounts of model-based surprise to inform our understanding of what might be going on with children's pupil dilation in this task. The first hypothesis of how surprise is expressed via pupil dilation is that surprise is a response to how unlikely the observed event was, so given the learner's current beliefs. And this is captured computationally via Shannon information. This is because Shannon information can be thought of as how informative new evidence is in terms of capturing a conflict between expectation and reality. So under this model, stronger surprise occurs following unlikely events. And I think this account, this kind of model, might be related to the first version of the learning story that I laid out here. The second hypothesis of how surprise is expressed via pupil dilation is that it's a response to how much learning occurs following the observed evidence. So this is captured computationally via the Kullback-Leibler divergence. So we might say that surprise may come about as an experience of the amount of effort a learner might need to exert in order to learn. It's the shift of the current distribution of weights over their beliefs to the updated distribution following the evidence. So this relates to the second hypothesis because the divergence can be seen as a kind of degree of belief revision, and it considers the dissimilarity between prior beliefs and updated beliefs following the observations, with greater surprise indicating more change between belief states to accommodate the information. So this is captured mathematically as follows, but don't stress too much about the math if you don't want to. I can answer questions about it later. All right, so we modeled individual children's prior beliefs given their responses on the pretest. Then using Bayesian belief distributions for individual children for individual trials, we calculated these two different model estimates of surprise, trial by trial, given the child's evolving beliefs and the evidence presented on each trial. And then we correlated these surprise estimates to individual children's pupillary responses on each trial. So we looked at whether or not fits between the model are stronger in the prediction condition as compared to the post-diction condition, and we also compared the models. And what we found was that Shannon information did not particularly correlate with the pupil responses in either the prediction or post-diction conditions. But in contrast, we did see a significant correlation between pupil dilation and the Kullback-Leibler, the Kell divergence response. And this was significantly different from the Shannon information correlation as well. So these results provide, I think, some tentative evidence for the story that prediction is facilitating belief revision, which supports a surprise response that's based on these accommodation demands. I should note that pupillary responses are notoriously very noisy. This is why you need many trials of data. And our correlation between the model and the pupil change here are really modest at best. So I do think that we're going to need cleaner physiological markers to disentangle these hypotheses. But nonetheless, I think this is a sort of cool first attempt at distinguishing the kind of surprise that might be present, and further demonstrating that we only see this response systematically in conditions where children are prompted to predict. Okay, so prediction might support learning that triggers surprise, which in turn might further lead to a boost in encoding. And the reason we see these effects is because learning here is supported by children's rich, causal, abstract beliefs about, in this case, how objects displace water. My second point today is that prediction is shaped by pedagogical expectations. So some of you might be familiar with the line of work that I have on the role of pedagogical prompts on children's exploration and learning, which was and remains strongly inspired by Gergely and Chibra's work. One thread of this pedagogy work I have is focused on something I call pedagogical questions. So I recognize that the term pedagogy has a long history associated with it. Here, I'm simply defining pedagogical questions as questions asked by a knowledgeable and helpful other with the intention to teach, such as someone who understands a toy, how it works, asking a child, what do you think this button does? What's interesting about questions is that many include a predictive prompt. So we were curious whether framing information via a predictive pedagogical question, whether that might support young children's learning and memory, even in the absence of direct feedback about the prediction, as was received in the water displacement task that we saw. So we needed a domain where preschool children are undergoing belief revision. In past work, we've explored how to teach preschoolers about psychosomatic events, that being worried can cause tummy aches, things like that. And we found that reading storybooks with mechanism information, that helps preschoolers learn about this concept, at least in near generalization tasks. So to explore whether or not question asking, whether prompting children with prediction questions would boost memory and learning, we enrolled 72 preschoolers in a 2-week training study, learning about psychosomatic events. Participants were randomly assigned to either a direct instruction condition, a question asking condition, or a control condition. And the study included 3 visits over the course of 2 weeks. So first, children were given a pretest book to measure their beliefs about psychosomatic events. Only children who failed the pretest book, giving the wrong final answer, were enrolled in the study. That made sure that we were just measuring genuine learning about psychosomatic events over the course of the training. And then children were randomly assigned to one of the training conditions where they read different books. So the question asking and direct instruction books both highlighted psychosomatic causal mechanisms. The only difference between those books was whether or not the content information was sometimes presented in question form, as it was in the prediction question book. So for example, one page of one book in the direct instruction condition, children were read, when you feel happy, you might also smile. Your brain changes the signals to muscles in your face. And in the prediction question condition, children instead heard, when you feel happy, might you also smile? Does your brain change the signals to the muscles in your face? So text in the control books contained the same kinds of emotion and belief-related content as in the direct instruction and question books, but there's no focus on causally relevant phenomenon, and so it didn't provide any direct instruction or prediction questions about psychosomatic events. So to measure children's learning, during post-test, children completed 3 measures of psychosomatic understanding: a near generalization, a free explanation, and a far generalization. So for the near generalization task, participants were read a new storybook that was structurally identical to the pretest book, and they're asked to select the cause of the character's bellyache. The free explanation storybook tested children's ability to transfer knowledge to a novel task by asking with an open-ended prompt for explanations why a character's stomach hurt. And finally, children were given a far generalization task that required them to make judgments about the possibility of other psychological events causing physical effects. And in addition to the learning questions, the measures of psychosomatic understanding and generalization, participants were also asked questions to test their memory for details about the training books. So these included 3 causally relevant questions, like do you remember what happened to Gail in the story, as well as 3 questions on superficial, irrelevant content, like do you remember her name? So we computed a composite score of children's learning, generalization, and far transfer, transforming our scale so that the control condition is centering at 0. And as you can see, we found significant effects of both trainings as compared to the control. However, children in the prediction questions training also significantly outperformed children in the direct instruction condition. So looking at the results broken down by each specific measure, we see that this effect is primarily driven by children in the prediction question condition excelling in learning in the near generalization and transfer tasks. So very few children extended their knowledge from the relatively brief intervention to the far transfer task. And we find similar results for the memory scores. So as compared to children who read the baseline stories, children who are read storybooks that include prediction questions are more likely to remember the content. And this memory boost effect was particularly prevalent for the causally relevant details. So there was not actually a significant difference between conditions for memory of the irrelevant material. So the fact that group differences in children's memory for storybooks details was driven by the relevant story details only suggests that this question asking, this prediction prompt, might be particularly important for driving children's retention of the causally pertinent content. So these results suggest that prediction questions are boosting children's learning of causal content information because they're supporting memory and the consolidation of the content. So these results are dovetailing with the broad results and suggesting that prompting predictions is supporting children's learning and memory of content. And both are taking place in pedagogical settings, providing at least correlational cues. The pedagogical contexts are relevant here. But of course, the pedagogical contexts are not a variable that we're experimentally manipulating in these tasks. So to explore whether or not predictive prompts are also affecting children's active learning, including their exploration of the environment, and also to isolate the pedagogical features of these prompts, we have another set of studies on children's play. So let me first explain for a moment why I think both prediction and pedagogical contexts are relevant for guiding children's exploratory play. So asking for predictions here might support exploration because, first of all, if you ask a child for a prediction, probably they're going to make a mental prediction. And this might highlight uncertainty or a gap in their knowledge and sort of boost curiosity a la the gap effects like Lowenstein and others have argued for. It also might encourage confirmatory testing where children can demonstrate their knowledge. But because this is a pedagogical content, these predictive questions also carry some pragmatic information. So they might clue that there's something important to be learned. They might even imply that the child is assumed to be capable of discovering that thing on their own. So to look at this kind of hypothesis about the role of prediction on exploration, a previous honors thesis student of mine, Anishka Jean, designed a toy that made music when a block was placed on top of it and that had a switch and a dial that were reported to be relevant to get the machine to work when the block was on top. However, before children were given the chance to play with it, we surreptitiously deactivated the machine so that we could measure how many attempts children would take on their own before giving up or asking for help. So children were run in one of four conditions. In the pedagogical question condition, an experimenter who was known to be knowledgeable about how the toy worked asked the child to predict what happens if they changed the slides before the toy was given to the child to play with. In a direct instruction condition, the experimenter instructed the child to change these sliders to see what happens. So a contrast in these conditions is whether the child is actually being queried with a prediction. The direct instruction condition does not highlight a sort of knowledge gap for the child in the same way. We also read a condition where a naive Confederate is asking the experimenter about the sliders. A critical contrast between the pedagogical and, in this case, the information-seeking questions is that when a teacher is asking a prediction question to the learner, such as, what does this button do, the implication to the learner is that the teacher knows what the button does and is asking the learner because something about the button is important and should be learned. In contrast, an overheard naive question is, by definition, it implies that the questioner does not know the answer and is asking to obtain information. So in such cases, there's no reason to infer, for example, in this case, that the slider or the dial actually plays a critical function on the toy. So in addition to the inherent sort of prediction prompt is this expectation of information. The knowledgeable person is asking for a reason. If pedagogical questions also signal to the child an assumption of competence, so that the teacher's asking because she believes the child should be able to at least attempt a solution on their own, then we predict that children would persist longer in the pedagogical question condition as compared to the direct instruction or overheard naive information seeking question condition, which don't signal this assumed ability on behalf of the child. But we ran a final condition in which the child heard a pedagogical question just directed at another person. So interestingly, note that in this case, the overheard pedagogical question does not tell the eavesdropping child that competence is expected in them. So if this expectation of competence is important for driving sort of total exploration, we don't predict a boost in perseverance in the overheard pedagogical question condition. So again, we gave the children a chance to play in each condition, and we asked them to tell us when they were done, and we coded the number of different attempts they made to activate the toy when tinkering with it. And our results revealed a significant effect of pedagogical questions on children's perseverance here. Children in the pedagogical question condition conducted almost twice as many attempts on the toy before giving up as compared to children in the other conditions. So these results suggest that the means by which predictive pedagogical questions might increase children's play and learning is by signaling to them that there's something important to be learned and by empowering them to carry out this discovery on their own. So I think these results provide just one study that demonstrates that predictive questions, when framed in pedagogical contexts, that they're encouraging exploration and discovery. If you're interested in this work, I also encourage you to check out this previous paper demonstrating the role of pedagogical questions more generally in exploration and learning. Okay, so if prediction is interacting with social pedagogical inferences and can increase exploratory play and hypothesis testing, this can lead to more observed evidence and support learning. So I'm also going to suggest that prediction might also relate to theta, which is a brain measure that captures expectation of information. And theta might be a potential mechanism also for supporting learning. So prediction might facilitate learning by preparing us for information so that we know which information to attend and which representations to incorporate and be incorporated by that information. So if we run a prediction forward and we find that we have uncertainty about the outcome, then predictions can help us to attend to events with outcomes that we think are actually going to be informative. So it could be like a sous chef setting the stage, a mise en place for learning. And I'm stealing this coined reference from Golenkopf, Weisberg, and Hirsch-Pasek, who have used it to discuss the benefits of guided play. But the idea here is the same, that prediction might also be a tool that could help prepare our mind to attend, encode, and maintain new information when there's an expectation of information that follows that prediction. So to get at how this works, I'm going to suggest that neural markers in combination with behavioral data might help us understand this. So specifically, researchers have suggested that an electrical brain measure known as theta activation could be related to an expectation of information. So here's just one lovely study that uses this technique to look at infant speaker preference in language learning tasks, and it first got me excited about neural measures like this. So in brains, you've got oscillatory activity. This enables neural populations to work in unison. It allows multiple brain areas to coordinate activity into large-scale brain networks through phase synchrony. And in fact, in general, you've got like fast oscillators like gamma rhythm, which are facilitating local integration, whereas slow oscillators like theta are connecting many neurons in large brain areas, and thus facilitating information transfer between different structures of the brain. So the involvement of theta in memory formation, combined with theta's activities, combined with its tight association with reward processing, I think make it a uniquely suited tool for the investigation of the kinds of motivational mechanisms like expectation of information and curiosity that are associated with prediction. So I got very lucky that Katarina came to work with me as a postdoc for a couple of years. And during her time with me, she developed studies that are applying this method to look at this possible approach to studying curiosity and expectation of information in infants. So in the study that I'm about to present, this is really Katka's work. I've been very fortunate enough to collaborate with her on it and learn from her. She's now a professor at University of Copenhagen. She's going to be here tomorrow. So I strongly encourage you to follow her research in the years to come. Okay, so Katka and I are interested in this expectation of information response, particularly how early we could get at the signal. So we targeted the development of infant causal reasoning to investigate. So when given confounded evidence, even preschoolers spontaneously choose to explore more, and they can even select and design informative interventions to reveal the causal relationships between the objects that they are engaged with. So our question here was, do infants likewise distinguish between confounded and unconfounded data? And if so, does this sensitivity predict whether or not they will infer new causal structures? And our rather ambitious hypothesis was that theta activity is going to discriminate between infants who are sensitive to whether information is confounded and predict whether they will infer the correct causal structure through anticipatory looking. So to study this, we first introduced infants to causal structure videos, such as these that they saw for an example. So when a green block goes on the machine activates. And when an orange block goes on the machine, it does not activate. So I'll show you a video
Hej
here.
med dig. Se den her.
Hey baby, look.
Wow.
Wow. Some words are universal. All right. So in addition to the individual object trials, infants were also familiarized with what happens when the girl puts two objects on the machine at the same time. So in these trials, the objects are taken from the boxes and they're marked with their respective colors, and that helps the infants keep track. So in the end, we hope that infants learn that whenever a green object is placed on the machine, it will activate, and orange objects alone do not activate the machine. By the way, the colors are counterbalanced across infants' sides and everything, but I'm just going to use green and orange today for ease. Okay, so then comes the test trials, in which infants see a new object, so we don't know whether or not it triggers the effect or not. And this object gets placed on the machine, either together with an object that we know does make the machine work on its own, like a green one, or one that we know that does not activate the machine on its own. So in the trials where the new object is paired with one that we know works on its own, if we run this forward prediction here, we consider cases when the novel block might be green, and also when the novel block might be orange. And we know in every case that this machine must activate because this other green block is sufficient to make the machine go. As a result, we don't get to find out whether or not the new object works on its own. In other words, the information's confounded. So there's no opportunity for information here, and we don't expect to see an increase in theta as a result, which would measure that sort of expectation of information. In the other type of test trial, the object is paired with one that does not trigger the effect on its own. So here, if we run a forward prediction, we see that two outcomes are possible. The machine might activate or it might not. There's uncertainty about what's about to happen dependent on whether that novel object is green or whether it's orange. So crucially, whenever the outcome in this type of trial, whatever it is, infants can find out whether or not the new object makes the machine work. So if we see the effect, it must mean that that new object is a green block, and if there's no effect, it must mean that that new object otherwise belongs to the orange blocks. And so we can measure which box infants anticipatorily look to when it's then time to sort the labeled block. So first, we will look at the part of the trial before the girl places the objects on the machine, namely that first prediction and anticipation period. Remember, in the training trials, infants have watched the blocks go on the machine again and again. So on these test trials, by holding the blocks just above the machine for a few seconds, this likely triggers this natural simulated completion of the event, so a prediction about what will happen when the blocks are finally placed on the machine. And here we're going to investigate whether infants show sensitivity to whether the trial was confounded or unconfounded by measuring the differences in theta activity. So we have the confounded information trials where the infant can't find out whether the new object works or not, and the unconfounded in which they can. And what we see is that theta activity, what we see in the theta activity is significantly more activation in the unconfounded trials. So that's the dark red band that you see on the screen here with the sort of mustard box around it. So this suggests that infants between the ages of 15 and 17 months are showing sensitivity to whether or not information they're receiving is confounded or not. They're showing increases in brain activation right at this first prediction period that is associated with anticipation of information, as if they're gearing up to learn in these trials where there's something to be learned. So triggering a prediction here might be helping infants simulate an outcome and decide whether or not that outcome is likely to be informative or not. So next we wanted to look at what happens at the end of the trials, where if you remember, the girl is pausing with the novel object, and then the sorting cue is played. And here we want to see whether infants would predictively saccade to either of the two boxes, which would suggest that they're anticipating that the girl will place the novel object in one box or the other. And we can look at this because in addition to EEG, we're simultaneously recording infants' eye movements. So here's a video. So if you can see the little dots, you can see the infant looking off to the right. Of course, it ends in a cute smile. Cherry-picked videos are best for talks. Okay, so we're coding infants' looks only in the unconfounded condition where inference about the novel object is possible, and we're relating that correct looking pattern to the degree of theta response difference in the unconfounded trials. And what we find is for infants who correctively, predictively look, they're the ones that are showing the differentiation in theta responses between the unconfounded and confounded trials. So infants who did not correctly learn the prediction, those did not show the differentiated theta response during the anticipation trials. So I think these results suggest that not only are infants sensitive to whether or not information that they're receiving is confounded or not, but this sensitivity or ability to recognize an upcoming learning opportunity relates to whether or not infants are making that correct inference and predicting actions based on those inferences. So the suggestion here is that infants might be running this forward prediction during that first anticipation period, and this is helping them distinguish between outcomes that generate informative information or not. And those sort of high prediction infants are the same ones who are correctly predicting the block location at the end of the story. Now, we suggest that theta, I think, might be a neural marker that is rising out of this expectation of information, and this explains, I think, how the brain might help prepare for new information. This brain-based response helps with attention, with encoding, and maintenance of information to support learning. So of course, in the current study, we don't know if infants are explicitly making predictions, but in new work in my lab, we're looking at this theta response in older children, doing tasks like the water displacement task I talked about first, to see whether or not we can get clearer links between this neural and behavioral response. So I've suggested that prediction is linked to an expectation of information. Prediction can facilitate anticipation of new data, which is yielding a stronger theta response. And this theta has been suggested to be a measure of expectation of information and is linked to better learning. So similarly, prediction might support learning by bolstering this expectation of information, which is gearing the brain up to encode and be rewarded by new information. So if prediction is akin to something like forward mental simulation, then it might support learning even in the absence of information. So indeed, there's a postdoc, actually more of a collaborating research scientist in my lab, Igor Baskanjev, who's been interested in the role of thought experiments in supporting learning. So one idea is that a well-designed thought experiment could tap into these sort of intuitive simulations that are supporting generalization and abstraction of information, such that thought experiments can support learning even in the absence of observing evidence. So in the brief time remaining, I'm going to talk quickly about two ongoing studies of Igor's looking at this phenomenon. So for the first project, we're interested in seeing if engaging in mental prediction through thought experiments, whether that would help elementary school children develop correct beliefs in the material and non-material distinction realm. So the idea that material things have weight and occupy space. So we tested 100 children. They were randomly assigned to one of 3 different conditions: a baseline condition, a real experiments condition, and a thought experiment condition. And children first received a set of physics questions in a pretest, and then several weeks later, they were given the same questions again in post-test. And so we've got children in the baseline condition who are receiving no training between pretest and post-test, but children in the thought and real experimental conditions are receiving physics trainings over the course of several modules, each about a week apart. The content of the training was the same across these 2 training conditions. However, it differed in one critical aspect. And that's whether or not the instruction in the real experiments, and that's whether or not the instruction in the content was actually observed by the children. So in the real experiments conditioned, the instruction was accompanied by real experiments, but the instruction in the thought experiment condition was only accompanied by thought experiments. So children in this condition did not see any real experimental demonstrations or the outcomes of those experiments. So for example, the main goal in Module 1 was to help children realize that, say, occupying space is a necessary property of all material things, and that if something occupies space, it means that it's material. So children were told that one good way of seeing if something occupies space is to check if it can fill up a balloon. So if it can, then it means that it takes up space. So in the real experiment condition, children saw a series of real experimental demonstrations of filling up a balloon with water, with sand, with air, as well as failed attempts to fill up a balloon with thoughts, light, and sound. However, children in the thought experiments condition were only invited to imagine filling up the balloons with these different entities and report the outcomes of the thought experiments that they carried out in their mind. So after several weeks of training like this, children received a final physics understanding battery of 48 questions, just like in the pretest, that were coded as correct or not, and normalized so that the average score is centered at 0. And that means that the post-test scores that you're about to see are the changes in what happened from pre to post-test, the learning score. So what we found is, while there was no change in learning in the baseline condition for the children who didn't receive training, unsurprisingly, children in both the real experiments and thought experiments condition improved significantly. And in fact, there was no difference in learning performance between the real and thought experiment conditions. So performing this mental prediction in the form of a thought experiment was helping these early elementary school children revise their initially incorrect intuitive beliefs about matter, even in the absence of observing actual physical experiments. So why should making predictions like this support learning? Well, predictions might highlight places where beliefs are in conflict. Children can hold conflicting beliefs, things like air is made up of nothing and it weighs nothing, and they also know that you need air to breathe and that air fills up balloons. So when you're engaging in a thought experiment, it might bring these kinds of conflicts together in your mind. And so this suggests that prediction as thought experiment might be most helpful when you're actually simulating cases that are highlighting these conflicts with your established domains and beliefs. So in a different study, Igor set out to see whether or not different kinds of thought experiments, specifically whether ones that helped highlight contradicting beliefs, might best support learning. So as noted earlier in the talk, children between the ages of 6 and 9 are incorrectly believing that heavier objects rather than objects with bigger volume are displacing more water. And at the same time, we know that even infants are sensitive to the principles of solidity, right? So the idea that two physical bodies can't occupy the same space at the same time. So what follows from this principle of solidity is that when an object is submerged in fluid, the amount of fluid that is being displaced is equal to the volume of the submerged object. So that is, the volume can't be occupied by two material bodies at the same time. So we wondered whether or not children could learn about water displacement without receiving any new empirical data, simply by relying on their understanding of the solidity principle. So we tested 70 children between 6 and 9 years old. Children were randomly assigned to one of two conditions. In the perfect fit condition, children were presented with 6 extreme case learning trials in which the blocks were a perfect fit to the container, which really, I think, highlights the solidity idea. In contrast, in the loose fit condition, children were presented with 6 trials in which the blocks were not a perfect fit to the container. And in both conditions, children were prompted to make a mental prediction by asking them to imagine what would happen to the water if the objects were pushed down into the container. So children are not receiving any feedback about what would actually happen throughout the experiment. Next, all children received 6 transfer tests where the submerged objects were loosely fitting balls. And then finally, all children received far transfer trials in which they're asked about the exact amount of water displaced by a given object. So we found that on the first 6 trials that included the extreme case thought experiments, in the perfect fit condition, children are performing significantly better than in the loose fit condition. Furthermore, children in the perfect fit condition perform better on the 6 transfer trials than children in loose fit condition, and children in that perfect fit condition are also performing significantly better on the far transfer trials than children in the loose fit condition. So these findings suggest that correcting entrenched misconceptions about the physical world need not always be based on empirical observations, which is, I think, routinely emphasized in developmental theories. But it can also be based on knowledge that children already have, if such knowledge is brought to bear in the learning context by prompting children to make predictions, in this case, via thought experiments. So the work I've presented today suggests that children's predictions are leveraging their abstract beliefs, and we can see this kind of surprise response that are elicited. But we also see the role of these abstract beliefs, the prior beliefs, throughout the studies that I've talked about today. And we see that prediction is interwoven with pedagogical expectations, and this shapes learning and memory. And finally, that prediction is engaging forms of active learning that entail exploration, expectation of information, mental simulation, and recognition of contradicting beliefs. So the ways in which prediction interacts with our abstract beliefs and our inferences about others, this is allowing children to go beyond anything we see in current AI models, to leverage mechanisms like curiosity and exploration, computations of information gain, mental simulation, recognition of contradictions in our beliefs, all these mechanisms that I think are supporting children's learning in really rich ways. So if we're going to build accurate models of human cognition that help us to understand how children are so smart, we have to consider the role of these incredible cognitive processes learners are bringing to the table, and the ways, at least in this case, that predictions are supporting them. So this is just the beginning of a large research program, and I predict that there is more to learn here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the amazing talk. We have plenty of time for questions.
Wonderful. Thank you. Your work on pedagogical questions versus information-seeking questions have demonstrated that there are different intonations that mark the fact whether the questioner is actually lacking the information he's asking for, or whether he knows and is just trying to have a kind of a pedagogical influence on the child. So that made me think, while you were talking, that in the classical Wimmer-Perner theory of mind task, where the experimenter is asking where the protagonist is going to believe the object is, or where he's going to look for the object, there has been a lot of puzzlement about why implicit tasks show the ability to attribute false beliefs earlier. And there have been ideas about a pragmatic explanation of this question being kind of pragmatically ill-formed, because he just as a child, he knows where he believes the object is, and so that cannot be what he asked. So I was wondering whether if you would look at the way the question in this task is asked, and maybe vary whether it is asked as a pedagogical prosody or an actual information-seeking prosody, that would actually modify the results. And I just wonder what you think.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So there's a couple of answers to that. The first is you're absolutely right. The pragmatics of these questions really do matter. So I have another paper called a Neutral Queries something, where we look at varying whether or not the person asking the question is knowledgeable or not. And we have children generate a guess just about what cup a sticker is under. So we all know in research that children tend to switch their responses upon repeated questioning. So if you ask a kid something like, after they give a response, are you sure? Is that your final answer? They'll switch their response to the other thing. So we vary whether or not the person is knowledgeable or not in those tasks, and what we find is that switching behavior significantly decreases. So 4-year-olds are sensitive, we didn't test it with younger kids, sensitive to whether or not that person is knowledgeable. So when they say, are you sure? they only switch that response or significantly switch that response when they're perceived to be knowledgeable. So you're exactly right. There's pragmatics that are playing a role here. It's also the case that Igor has looked at things like prosody in pedagogical questions. So we find significant differences in the ways that pedagogical questions are asked as compared to information-seeking questions. So if you want to know whether the sky is blue and you genuinely don't know, you might say like, well, is the sky blue? But if you're asking someone pedagogically, the tone might be something more like, is the sky blue? Right? So there's like differences in the way that we say that. Children are sensitive to those differences. So if you're hearing exactly the same sentence and all you have is the acoustic information, you're not throwing all this other information that we do with the children, like as the person telling them that they're knowledgeable and everything. They can distinguish. 6-year-olds at least can do so. 4-year-olds are not significantly different there, but they can, just from hearing the difference in prosody, they can say this person is teaching and not that person. We also looked at the way parents are asking questions to their children in storybook tasks. So we have a task where the parents are knowledgeable, and so they read the story first, and then they ask children questions about the story, so they're naturally prompting pedagogically we don't tell the parents ahead of time, right, be pedagogical, that's just a natural task, versus we have the parents with earphones, so the kids read the story, and then the parents are told that they have to ask their kids information about the story, so they're not knowledgeable. Parents change their prosody naturally, so they're sensitive to that, and that's happening really in the world. This deeper question about pragmatics and whether or not that explains why shifts, for example, in the theory of mind task are occurring the way they are is a really interesting one. There's a related domain that Jonathan Kaminsky and I have been looking at, which is counterfactual questions. So if you do the sort of classic Rafstetter and others have done this work on, this person has dirty shoes and they walk across the carpet, and would the carpet still have had footprints on it if the shoes weren't dirty? Jonathan's come up with some really clever ways to ask those counterfactual questions, but we change whether or not the person asking the counterfactual question is presumed to be knowledgeable versus not, so whether or not it's this pedagogical context, and that shifts the behavior. Jonathan, can you remind me what the full result is? You've got a mic anyhow, so.
The short version is, the classic pattern is that in overdetermined cases, so where you have two people walking across the carpet and you ask what if one of them had taken their shoes off, kids fail until they're like almost 10 years old. It's ridiculous. But then but that's past work, the person telling them the story and the person asking the question has been the same person, so they're knowledgeable. When the person asking the question doesn't know that it's overdetermined, they only saw one of the two causes, then in 5-year-olds and 7-year-olds, but oddly not 6-year-olds, we're still not sure why, you see like 50% jump in accurate responses. So there's definitely a component of it. It doesn't completely explain the failures, but it's definitely part of it.
So I think you're exactly right that this is a really interesting domain to look at. And so I'd be curious if someone wants to run the theory of mind version of pedagogical versus non-pedagogical prompts. Talk to me. I'm happy to see what happens there. But there's some evidence that supports exactly your intuition. Thanks. Were you actually next, Jonathan?
Yes, I was actually next to that happens. So this is about the last study with it was interesting to me that you referred to the solidity expectation. There's some work by Susan Hespos about infants' expectations about substances. And solidity is actually something that I think these are 10-month-olds, that they find they have weaker solidity expectations for substances. So they expect something like a liquid to be able to pour through a grating, and they expect water and sand to follow similar rules, for example.
Yeah, and it changes right when they start to get older. The grasp also changes their understanding of it right around the same age. So whether they palm it or grasp
Yeah,
it.
and they actually have a version where it's pushing a grating down into water versus into a solid, and whether they expect it to be blocked or not. So given that, it's actually interesting to me that you get the results that you do. And I was curious about whether that indicates that like it's actually more about the tight fit itself rather than solidity per se, whether there's something special about taking up the full volume versus taking up part of the volume that is sort of related but separate type of solidity expectation.
Yeah, I mean, the point is that the full volume there makes the solidity salient, right? Because there's nothing else that could exist. It's sort of, it has to be brought to mind or brought to bear there. There's a lot of learning that happens between, say, 12 months and 6 years, as it turns out. So I do believe that even if there's some refinement of the solidity principle that happens in early infancy, from early infancy, that there's still knowledge there that is being brought to bear. So I think you're right, but I do think that it has to do with this sort of salience of the fact that, like, wait, this is really taking up the whole space. If something, and thus you can't have two things taking up the whole space in the same place. Thank you. Good.
Thank you for the talk. I want to ask whether or not you think the predictions qualities are also going under some type of developments, or do you think it's always some form of simulation?
Can you tell me more about that? So whether predictions, I didn't hear the word that
the
followed
qualities of the prediction for different age groups, do you think that it also goes under development, or it's always some type of simulation?
That's a great question. So the studies that I talked about today were primarily with older children. I had some preschool data, and I did have the Kotka work that was 15 to 17-month-olds. But there is a question about sort of the mental simulation and whether they're carrying out some rich imagination or what's developing there. This is a question that's near and dear to my heart. My graduate student, Michelle Wong, is actually looking at exactly this question right now. So she's looking, and in collaboration with Tomer Ullman, who does a lot of really beautiful work on mental simulation, mental imagery, and the sort of ways in which we sort of are rendering partial aspects of the scene, even if we're generating a physics engine that's helping generate details there, that's generating the sort of properties of the objects there. So I really care about that. I'm really interested in it. I don't have data yet, but the prediction that I have is that younger children actually are probably going to have, even if they have this sort of core physics engine that's helping them render and predict outcomes. I think that's what underlies the sort of violation of expectation data that we see in very early infancy, that the richness of that mental simulation is not going to be as robust in early childhood. And also critically that there's these metacognitive skills that are being brought to bear on the learning and the belief revision. So critically recognizing that there's a conflict there when you do generate some kind of simulation is really important to undergo that belief revision. So there's an additional connection and an additional step there. And Dani Abunto, who was a master's student working with me and in collaboration with Igor Baskanjev, and I have also looked at this idea of whether or not recognizing a conflict in the world predicts sort of physics knowledge and physics understanding, and that's something that's developing it's a sort of metacognitive skill that's developing much later in childhood, like 6 to 9, as opposed to earlier. That is something that predicts that knowledge. We find that in our paper coming out soon, I hope. And so there's all these different components that I think that are involved when you're undergoing belief revision that are going to have things that are developing. So some kind of engine, I think, is in place from infancy, and that's relevant for doing violation of expectation detection. The richness of that imagery, I think, is something that's probably going to be changing over development. Stay tuned from Michelle's work. But there's all these other components to belief revision that also get brought to bear, like, is this a conflict here? How does this relate to past data? How am I going to use that to update my beliefs? Will I remember what I just saw that I think are also executive functions and metacognition things that are going to get tapped that are coming in later childhood? So I think those are multiple developmental components. That answer your question, I hope? Okay, thanks for it.
Okay, thank you. I have a question about question. and the question is whether you have explored, or if it is relevant at all, the form of the questions, or any kind of question, besides the fact that they have to be pedagogical questions. The reason why I'm asking is that there are theories that say that, for example, the very fact that I ask you a question essentially has to be interpreted as a disjunction, as a modal, in which if I tell you, do you want an apple, I really say, that because I assume that you have alternatives available, and therefore I erase the alternatives. And it's really an issue about giving you the possibility of conceiving alternatives. And that is very clear when you ask a question which is a disjunctive question, which is many of the questions in terms of like the decisions. And I wonder whether you have explored whether there is some kind of form of question that is the form of question that more, as it were, foster the fact that you, as it were, put yourself into a modal space, essentially.
Yeah, great question. So I'd love to look at sort of, I could imagine the question, everyone could hear it, there's a microphone, sorry. Okay, so there's a question about whether the form of the question shapes, say, learning and prediction. You can imagine asking questions like, do you think it's A or do you think it's B, right? Which immediately constrains the hypothesis space for the learner. You could ask a question like, why do you think that happened? Which is a much broader sort of space of hypotheses. You could ask a question like, well, how do you think that happened? Is sort of, you could ask a question like, what happened, which focuses the learner on descriptions. There's really beautiful work looking at sort of the role of explanations in supporting learning and learning by explanation. And in those tasks, children are often given two different kinds of question. They're asked a question like, why did that happen or how did that happen? Or the comparison conditions that they look at are what happened, describe what happened. And when, so work from Karen Walker has done a lot of this kind of work, often in collaboration with Tanya Lombroso, who's done some of this. Alison Gopnik might have been involved in some of those papers. And so we know from that, from those kinds of prompts and from those kinds of experiments, that the form of the question really does matter, because when children are generating explanations, they're focusing on abstraction of the content. That's often supporting learning, but sometimes you can design an experiment, you can design the data in a way that abstraction is actually not helpful, because you have to pay attention to the specific properties. Joseph Williams has some work on that, as compared to when they're describing the event or the scene. So that's just one sort of large body of research that I know of that looks at that particular kind of form. But I think that there's much more there, right? This question of sort of, am I constraining the hypothesis space for the learner? And that's something like, if I say, is it A or is it B versus why did that happen? And that's something that I think can definitely shift sort of the approach that a child might take, especially for younger children. That constraint might actually be really beneficial for helping guide their exploration or their decisions in exploration. Whereas for younger children, you might see the more open-ended questions. If they have some mechanism knowledge already in mind, they might explore more broadly or do more exploration that might lead to discovery of surprising or unintuitive outcomes. That's my hypothesis, and I think it's a beautiful, really interesting point, but I haven't personally looked specifically at that as the sort of focus or manipulation. But thank you. I see.
Yes, hi. Great talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I have a question about the second study, so again, about questions, and in particular, predictive questions, right? Because you said these questions help with learning. And I was wondering, did you tease apart the contribution of it being a question versus it being a predictive question? In other words, did you have a condition with post-predictive questions? You know, because I was thinking, is it that what is important is that you are simulating the future and that helps with learning? Or is it the fact that you are giving them a question which prompts them to interact more with the material? And so I thought that that would have been a critical comparison. Thanks.
Thank you for that question. Yes, great. So in the storybook task, which was the second task that I talked about, we did not compare different kinds of questions. They were predictive questions, and they occurred as part of the mechanism training. In Garvin's work, those questions are either predictive questions or post-dictive questions. So they're getting exactly the same question in those cases, but one is happening before they see the evidence and the other is happening after they see the evidence, and that does lead to a difference between those conditions. In both conditions, the kids are learning. So they're learning from the evidence that they're seeing trial by trial, but you're getting a learning boost when they are prediction questions coming before the evidence, and that boost is, you see more flexible belief revision, you see more correlations with the rational optimal Bayesian updating. So that's the evidence that I have that it's about the prediction question, that it's a prediction as opposed to something else, because it's exactly the same question essentially, except it's what had you thought would have been the case, because it's a reverse inference. So hopefully that partially addresses the question. Thanks.
Okay, our time for question is up. So let's thank Elizabeth once again.